Hey guys, welcome to lecture 2.1 Molecules to Metabolism. So, the essential idea for this topic is that living organisms control their composition by a complex web of chemical reactions. So, you probably hear me say in class all the time biology is just applied chemistry. And it's true. And we're going to talk about that today. Understanding number one. Molecular biology explains living processes in terms of the chemical substances involved. So, in molecular biology, we study the structure and function of the molecules that are essential to life. Example reactions include what do you think? Can you think of any? Well, by now, hopefully, you can think of like photosynthesis, right? And cellular respiration, or maybe hydrolysis and dehydration synthesis. Those are things we learned before. On the right hand side of your screen, you're going to see what looks like a piece of paper and somebody writing. And that's because with your lecture, you should have uh, understandings, skills, and applications. And these are the benchmarks that IB wants you to know. So, how you take your notes is up to you, but I would definitely make sure you either print out those understandings or write them on a piece of paper and take notes that correspond to the objectives that go with those understandings and skills, because that's what you're going to be tested on, right? So the lectures are pretty straightforward. They're exactly the information that IB wants you to know. And then the activities that we're going to do in class support that knowledge. But you are in charge of taking your own notes and making sure you put them in your binder. So, A1, this is an application. A application. Urea is an example of a compound that is produced by living organisms but can also be artificially synthesized. So, urea is a organic compound, and when we say the word organic means two things. Right? We're not talking about like Whole Foods. That's not what we mean. We mean contains carbon and is produced by living things. So, when you go to the store and you are buying organic vegetables, people automatically think that means better. Organic doesn't mean better. Organic means it was treated with fertilizers and pesticides that are chemicals that are produced by living things, right? So, any venomous or toxic animal, that venom and those toxins, those are organic. They're produced by a living thing and they contain carbon. So don't be confused when you hear the word organic. It doesn't necessarily mean better. So a lot of times, like my dad's an organic farmer and he uses fish emulsion as a fertilizer. I don't know if you've ever smelled fish emulsion. It's disgusting. It's basically like fish guts, right? Super gross. But that's an organic fertilizer, and his plants turn out great. His garlic is awesome. So organic means a compound that contains carbon that's produced by living things. Urea is an organic compound that's produced by organisms when breaking down proteins. So like when you eat meat, your body digests that meat and breaks those proteins down into their monomers into amino acids. Urea is a byproduct of that process. We excrete urea via urine. Urea was also synthesized in a laboratory, and it's used as, guess what? Fertilizer, because it contains a lot of nitrogen. Nitrogen is a limiting factor for plants. Remember, limiting factors are things that prevent the population of something from getting too big. So we use nitrogen in the form of urea as an organic fertilizer. So, organic molecules, like I said, are carbon based and they're synthesized by living organisms. And we talk about four major categories. If some of you are having flashbacks to freshman year, you should be. This is the macromolecules unit that you did freshman year. So, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Remember, carbon is special. It has 6 protons, also 6 electrons, and 6 neutrons. Those 6 protons and neutrons are in the nucleus. And those electrons are on the shells, the orbitals around the outside. Carbon has 4 valence electrons, meaning 4 electrons on the outer shell. Now, on that second outer shell, or the second orbital, that outer shell, there always wants to be, or there needs to be 8 electrons in there, but there's only 4. The inner ring is stable with 2, but the outer ring is unstable, right? So it's looking for 4 more electrons. That means carbon has the ability to bond with 4 other things at the same time. That is why carbon is so versatile. It's going to bond with 4 molecules all around it. It's like the centerpiece. When it bonds with other molecules, it shares those electrons in the hopes of having that stable valence shell. So here, this is methane, CH4, otherwise known as farts and burps, right? So here you can see the carbon molecule on the left and the hydrogen molecule on the right. Now, we just talked about how the inner shell wants 2 valence electrons and the outer shell wants 4 valence electrons. So neither of these molecules is considered stable. They need to fill those shells. So carbon's not stable. It needs 4 more electrons. And that hydrogen isn't stable. It needs one too. So when you get a bunch of carbon together and a bunch of hydrogen together and they're unstable, they bond to form compound molecules, like methane. Now, drawing that's a pain in the butt, so we don't have to draw that whole thing. Instead, we're gonna use skeletal structures or dot structures. So here we have a carbon in the middle, and it's sharing bonds with 4 hydrogens. Now, these are covalent bonds. They're not hydrogen bonds. We'll talk about hydrogen bonds later. These are covalent bonds where they're sharing electrons. 1 dash means 2 electrons, right? 1 dash is a bond between 2 electrons. All this bond is stored energy that keeps those electrons together. Now, we could do dot diagrams. They're the same thing, but it's just easier to draw a skeletal diagram. 1 dash is 2 electrons. Remember, carbon creates 4 bonds to be stable, and that's what makes it such a good molecule for building life because it's very flexible. Look at all these different kinds of molecules and shapes that you can build with carbon. Remember, 1 dash equals 2 electrons. So how many electrons there? There should be 2. Because of this ability to bond with 4 different molecules at the same time, we get a wide variety of simple to complex structures. Some of these might look familiar to you, others might not. We'll see how much you remember in a little bit. Understanding number 3. Life is based on carbon compounds including carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. Monomers are building blocks, and they're small carbon molecules, while polymers are larger chains of monomers, and they're more complex. So here's our monomer. Together, they build a polymer. So here we have a summary table of some monomers and polymers from the basic categories. So we have carbohydrates, right? This is our CHO, CHON, CHOMP table. Carbohydrates have a 1 to 2 to 1 ratio of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. The monomers are monosaccharides or simple sugars, something like glucose or ribose. The polymers are going to be disaccharides or polysaccharides. Lipids, we have a 1 to 2 to few carbon ratio, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And these guys are our fatty acids. Remember, we have cis and trans fatty acids, and we have glycerol. Now, together, these create lipids like phospholipids, which have 2 tails, and triglycerides that have 3 tails. Next, we have proteins, which are made up of amino acids. These guys contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and for the first time, we have nitrogen, right? And these guys look like butterflies. We have our central carbon, we have some hydrogens. Oh, we have an amino group, right? We have our, let's see, in our carboxyl group, we have our NH3. We have our carboxyl group. Oh, that's not a 2. It's a CO group. We've got that hydrogen here, and then we have that R group. And that R group, there's 20 different R groups. Don't worry, we'll learn more about that later. Just a quick reminder. These guys look like the butterflies. Together, amino acids create proteins or polypeptide chains. And this is where we talk about different levels. We have primary, which is the order, primary order. We have secondary structure, right? We have tertiary structure, and we have quaternary structure. And then we have nucleic acids: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and for the first time, phosphorus. These are our nucleotides. Together, they create nucleic acids, DNA, and RNA. And remember, these guys have the sugar, phosphate, and nucleotide. So there's the nucleotide, right? And the phosphate, the sugar, and the backbone. And we'll learn all about those coming up. As a review, simple sugars, right? These guys are the building blocks of carbohydrates, polysaccharides. 2 monosaccharides that you have to know. You have to know glucose, and you have to know it's glucose because, hey, guess what? It's got 6 sides. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? If it's 6-sided, it's glucose. Next, we have ribose, right? And we know it's ribose because it's got 5 sides. It's a pentose sugar. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. Remember these fatty acids? We have these long chains of hydrogen and carbon. These guys are the building blocks of lipids and fats. Saturated fatty acids have single bonds only. And remember, if they had a double bond there and say they were missing one of these H's, that would be an unsaturated fatty acid, right? Unsaturated, we have cis and trans. We have some that are bent. Don't worry, we'll get into like the super big details or super tiny details later. This is just a review of stuff that we learned freshman year. Here we go. There's our amino acids. We have our amine group. We have our carboxyl group. We have our central hydrogen, and we have our R group. And sometimes these are flip-flopped, but that's okay. And remember, there's 20 R groups, which means we have 20 different amino acids. And from those 20 amino acids, you get all the billions of proteins that create life on Earth. It's like having an alphabet that's 20 letters long. Here's our phospholipids. We have our ping pong ball head, and we have our fatty acid tails, right? Our glycerol molecule and our fatty acids. And we have triglycerides with 3 tails instead of 2. And here's our glycerol head. It's just turned sideways. Here's our proteins, right? We have 1 single amino acid, and when you chain those amino acids together, you get a polypeptide. And then depending on how many polypeptide chains you have put together, you have a protein. So, with that review, I know it was quick, but remember, we learned a lot of this freshman year, and you can always go back and read the textbook. If you're not sure how to find your electronic book online, click on the How Do I button on the home page. You'll find a page that says, How do I find my online book? Click the link, and there you have it. Make sure you're reading section 2.1. So here is 4 simplified diagrams, one of each different kind of macromolecule. At this point, you should be able to tell me which one is which. Once you've done that, we'll move on to understanding number 4. And no, I'm not going to tell you the answer. You have to figure it out. Okay, understanding number 4. Metabolism is the web of all enzyme catalyzed reactions in a cellular organism. So, within organisms, molecules are constantly being synthesized and broken down via 2 pathways, catabolic and anabolic, right? So, this is all the food that we eat. We take it in and we break it down into those, remember, our food are polymers, and our intestines break it down into monomers, right? And then we use it to build into things that we need, like proteins back into polymers, right? Proteins, DNA, right? These are all polymers. So, catabolic means to break something down, like cats are always knocking stuff off the counters and they're always breaking stuff. And anabolic is to build. This is why athletes and weightlifters, if they're doping, they're taking anabolic steroids because they want to build bigger, right? So catabolic, break, anabolic, build. And life is a collection of these processes, breaking things down, getting energy out of it, and then using those pieces like Legos to build the molecules that we need. So, anabolic reactions. Remember condensation reactions or dehydration synthesis, right? Condensation, dehydration, we're going to remove water, and synthesis, we're going to create. Synthesis means to create. And dehydration, that water is going to fall out. We use energy from anabolic reactions to build polymers for monomers, right? So here's our water. Here we have, what is that? You should be able to tell me what that is. C6H12O6. Okay, so that's a carbon to hydrogen to oxygen 1, 2, 1. And it doesn't have nitrogen or phosphorus, so I'm guessing that's a carb. And you should, at this point, have this one memorized. That's glucose, right? So here we have glucose, probably plus another glucose, and that gives us a disaccharide, and that water molecule is going to fall out. So let's take a look. Yep, I was right. There's that glucose molecule. And oh, it's a ribose. There we go. It's a ribose molecule. It's 5-sided. They're going to join together, and that water's going to fall out. One more time. This is a refresher from freshman year. Now, catabolic reactions, they're going to be the opposite, right? You're going to add that water back in to break this down. We also called this hydrolysis, right? Lysis means to break, and hydro means water. So we're breaking stuff with water. Here's that lovely disaccharide. We're going to add that water back in and break those molecules apart. As a review, anabolic reactions consume energy. It takes energy to build things, right? We're going to form covalent bonds between molecules, between atoms to make bigger molecules. Water is removed. That's why it's also called dehydration synthesis, right? And we go from small monomers to large polymers. Conversely, we have catabolic reactions, otherwise known as hydrolysis, right? Hydro, water. Lysis means to break. And we release energy when we break chemical bonds that hold molecules together. We're going to break that covalent bond. We're going to add some water to help break that bond. And we're turning polymers, bigger molecules, into small. So big to small, right? No, that's backwards. Backwards. No. Monomer is small. Small to big, right? Big to small. So at this point, you should be able to do these things. You should be able to define molecular biology. You should be able to define organic compounds. You should be able to list the 4 major classes of biomolecules. You should be able to define metabolism. You should be able to outline the differences between anabolism and catabolism and draw some simple diagrams of glucose, ribose, a fatty acid, and an amino acid. All right, good luck.